How are your landings doing? There is no mystery in leaving smooth air flight and softly landing on a hard piece of ground after a few bumps of the landing gear wheels. Nevertheless, doing it within a restricted flight path and limited airspeed might require some skill. This video will show you some important approach and landing facts that will enhance your ability to make an air-to-ground transition as smooth as it should be. At first, let's follow the complete approach and landing procedure. Afterwards, we are going to assess some particularities governing the procedure. For a normal landing procedure, the landing configuration, gear down and flaps extended, should be established early. Airspeed, thrust, and rate of descent should be stabilized early. Avoid power-off approaches. Make sure that the airplane is properly trimmed during the approach. This maximizes elevator authority for the flare, or in the event of a missed approach. Target approach speed is VAPP, which is VREF plus wind correction. VAPP should be reduced so that VREF is attained upon crossing the threshold. As the airplane approaches the touchdown point, reduce the rate of descent and slowly reduce thrust levers to idle so that they are idle when the airplane touches down. Normally, a 2 to 3 degree pitch change will be enough for the flare. Plan to touch down as close as possible to the 1,000-foot point. Do not allow the airplane to float in ground effect, which unnecessarily increases the landing distance. Apply back pressure on the yoke after the main gear touches down and smoothly ease the nose wheel onto the runway. Apply forward pressure on the yoke after the nose wheel touches down to maximize directional controllability. Quite easy. You can smoothly land on a fine day on a long, dry runway. But even under demanding circumstances, you can make it easy too, once you have trained enough and know how your airplane performs, and you are really concentrated on what is going on. Let's discuss now the particularities of the operation. No approach should be initiated unless the prevailing conditions have been understood and the crew found that landing is acceptable without undue risk. Philosophically, all approaches should be treated as approaches followed by missed approaches, and landing should be treated as the alternate procedure. This mindset depends on a good approach briefing and the knowledge of the missed approach procedure, and on proper programming of the FMS. The aircraft must be fully stabilized by 1,000 feet from touchdown under IMC conditions and by 500 feet under VMC conditions. A stable approach is a contributing factor to a successful flare and touchdown. Unstable approaches may result in difficult landings with unexpected sink rates, side loads, or bounce backs. An approach is considered stabilized when all of the following criteria are met. The aircraft is on the correct flight path. Only small changes in heading and pitch are required to maintain the correct flight path. The aircraft is in the correct approach speed and not less than VREF. The aircraft is in the correct landing configuration. Sink rate is no greater than 1,000 feet per minute. If an approach requires a sink rate greater than 1,000 feet per minute, a special briefing should be conducted. Power setting is appropriate for the aircraft configuration. All briefings and checklists have been conducted. Specific types of approaches are stabilized if they also fulfill the following: Instrument landing system approaches must be flown within 1 dot of the glide slope and localizer. A Category 2 or Category 3 ILS approach must be flown within 1/3 of a dot localizer band. During a circling approach, wings should be level on final when the aircraft reaches 300 feet above airport elevation, and unique approach procedures or abnormal conditions requiring a deviation from the above elements of stabilized approach require special briefing. An airspeed deviation is considered significant if it is 10 knots above target approach speed. Indicated airspeed may not be less than the VREF. A significant vertical speed deviation occurs when it is greater than 1,000 feet per minute, precision, or 1,500 feet per minute, non-precision, when below 1,000 feet above ground level. If the stabilized approach parameters are not met before reaching the stabilized approach height, a go-around should be initiated. To maintain a constant path profile and a given pitch attitude, there is only one thrust setting for one airspeed, considering that wind is constant at a certain flap position. Changing one of these variables will require an appropriate coordinated change in the other variables. If you try to stretch the glide path by applying back elevator without adding thrust, the result will be a shortened gliding distance. When the approach is too low, add thrust and raise the nose. Conversely, if the approach is too high, lower nose and reduce thrust. Therefore, the proper descent rate should be maintained by coordinating pitch, attitude, and thrust changes. The steeper the approach, the less thrust is needed. But remember, approaches with idle thrust should be avoided, particularly when operating a turbofan engine. In this condition, idle thrust, the crew has little control over the aircraft if a quick thrust correction becomes necessary due to a downdraft or if the speed suddenly drops. When an engine is at idle, spooling it up to a higher thrust condition takes far more time than when the engine is functioning above idle. The dynamics of a turbofan engine is such that the initial increase of thrust above idle must happen slowly, and only when a certain thrust value is reached does the pace of increase pick up. To cope with this delay in RPM acceleration, remember that the corrective thrust is proportional to the amount of sink rate that needs to be trimmed. Small amounts of sink rate will require smooth, gentle, and anticipatory corrections. Anticipate any need for more thrust and apply enough of it in good time. If you delay, you will need a lot more thrust. Similarly, if an excursion to a higher thrust setting has been necessary, don't leave thrust up far too long. Reduce thrust fairly soon and you will fly in a stabilized flight path again. As an airmanship principle, the aircraft should be fully trimmed at all times during any approach. This is especially true when it comes to aircraft where the longitudinal trim is based on change of the stabilizer incidence, because in these cases a mistrimmed aircraft is also an aircraft with reduced primary longitudinal control, as opposed to aircraft with trim tabs, where the mistrimmed condition means higher control forces only. Directional trim is especially important on one-engine and operative approaches. It is pretty easy to figure out if the aircraft is properly trimmed in yaw, if it has swept-back wings. If an aircraft is mistrimmed in yaw, assuming that the pilot is not pressing one pedal more than the other, it will require aileron inputs to remain level. So the yoke banked to one side is an indication that the aircraft needs directional trimming. To correct it, make sure that symmetrical thrust is set. Check fuel and balance, and trim the rudder to stop any turning tendency. The airplane is properly trimmed when the control wheel is neutral. On one engine inoperative, it may be desirable to center the rudder trim to assist direction control during thrust reduction. Centering the rudder trim prior to landing, normally prior to 500 feet above ground level, remove most of the rudder pedal pressure when the operating engine thrust is retarded to idle at touchdown. However, be prepared to counteract rudder pedal forces should a go-around be necessary. Generally, with reduced thrust and slower airspeed, the less lift on the wings and less downwind force on the horizontal stabilizer are produced, resulting in a significant nose-down tendency. Be prepared to reset this landing trimming condition when the landing is rejected or if a go-around is initiated. The target approach speed, VAPP, is equal to VREF plus 1/2 steady headwind component plus gust increment. VREF is the stall speed multiplied by 1.23 and the associated landing configuration, and is the speed at which the airplane should overfly the runway threshold.